Welcome to The Conscious Entrepreneur. Today, I'm honored to be talking with Tom Kolditz, a retired Brigadier General and expert in leadership, particularly in high-stakes environments. Tom has over 34 years of experience in the military, and he's held high-profile roles at West Point, Yale, and the Door Institute at Rice University. His book, In Extremis Leadership, is based on interviews with 175 leaders in extreme situations, offering invaluable insights into effective leadership during crises. In our conversation today, Tom shares how principles from military leadership apply to the entrepreneurial world, especially when navigating uncertainty and stress. He emphasizes the importance of trust, maintaining focus outward, and controlling emotions under pressure. We discuss the differences between coaching and mentoring and how each can significantly benefit entrepreneurs. Tom also covers practical ways to measure the effectiveness of coaching and the critical role of emotional intelligence in leadership. He gives us actionable advice on developing leadership skills, building a supportive environment around us, and balancing personal well-being while leading a team. With that, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Tom Kolditz. Tom, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining me on The Conscious Entrepreneur.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, Alex. Thank you.
I was so drawn to your work because you've studied military operations, you've studied leadership, you've studied mindset in really extreme circumstances. And in your first book, which is called In Extremis Leadership, you talk about your experiences having worked with and interviewed something like 175 leaders during very, very important crisis times, and learning from them what it looks like to be a great leader and the attributes of a great leader and how they can use those skills to get out of the extreme challenges that they're in. And the reason that I bring this up is our audience is entrepreneurs. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, the act of building a company can sometimes feel like it's life and death. Of course, most of the time it's not, but our brains don't always know the difference. Our amygdala don't always know the difference between really life and death and our perceived life and death, or ego life and death. And as you know, what that means is a lot of entrepreneurs are constantly in this fight or flight mode. They're constantly stressed out because they believe that what they're doing is living in crisis and they've got to get it right. And so that's what really attracted me to your work. And you have 34 years in the military. You were at West Point, you were at Yale, you were with the Door Center at Rice. And so there's a lot of experience here that I would love to tap into your brain to teach entrepreneurs about how to think when we are in crisis situations. So as we kick off here, the first question I just want to ask you is, if an entrepreneur is viewing the world and the success of his or her project in these life or death lenses, how can we start to apply some of the learnings from your work to make sure that this person gets through what they need to get through?
Well, I'll tell you, what makes dangerous circumstances truly dangerous is living with uncertainty. In the military, if you know exactly where the enemy is and exactly what they're about to do, you can take care of that, and there's really no danger there. But that's not the case usually. The enemy gets a vote. And in my coaching experience with, dozens of startup CEOs, one of the things I've found is that there's a lot of uncertainty in startups. You're dealing with that on a daily basis. You're trying to get your funding straight. You really don't know if you're going to last a quarter or a quarter century. And consequently, the principles and the things that we learn from leaders in dangerous contexts apply almost perfectly to the uncertain, chaotic set of circumstances that most startup CEOs go through. So while it might seem on the surface that they're very different, what's really important is the ability to lead people when uncertainty is the nature of the game. And that happens in both those circumstances.
I mean, uncertainty is the name of the game when you're building a company. You don't know what the future is going to look like. You don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. You're sort of living in this constant state of ambiguity. and you're really responsible to find success through, to make your way through this swamp no matter what.
Absolutely. And if you're living with uncertainty, you tend to not have the information that you might have in a more stabilized older company. And what that means is that your influence as a leader is not through management, it's through trust. People have to trust you because you're going to ask them to do things when you cannot guarantee them the outcome. And that means that trust is the coin of the realm. That means that's really the only leverage that you have. And it's the same in dangerous contexts. If you don't trust your leader, it's a horrible, horrible feeling. And so building and maintaining trust is common in both those circumstances.
So tell us more about this book, In Extremis Leadership. Tell us about the folks that you were interviewing. Tell us about the key takeaways from talking with so many leaders in life or death situations.
Well, sure. I initially put that book together at the request of the publisher, who had read an article that I wrote and said they'd publish a book if I extended it. And I thought I was writing a book that was primarily for military people, police, firefighters, EMTs, people who work in crisis daily. But one of the things I found was that these principles and the reaction to fear and anxiety that people have are precisely the same in civilian contexts and business contexts. And that book was initially published. It's been it had two publishers, but the first was in 2007, which you will recall was right before an enormous banking crisis. And I spent a tremendous amount of time in all of the big banks in New York City and many banks elsewhere, talking to people about how to lead in major crises, because there were suicides, there were huge levels of concern in that industry, and it worked out really well. I mean, I was able to help those people, and it really reinforced for me that learning about leading in dangerous places is really a lot broader than first responder kinds of circumstances. A lot to learn from people that are in crisis all the time.
Well, so one of the things that happens is when we're in crisis, we default, or we can default, I should say, to like the complete opposite behavior from what could be helpful. So, for example, when energy is flowing and energy is high, and people are spun up and they're already nervous, a lot of times the leaders are doing the exact opposite. Maybe they also start raising their voice and raising their energy and demanding that stuff happens. But I believe you found that there are very opposite, much more effective ways of dealing with this sort of thing.
Yeah, professionals who are in dangerous circumstances or crisis all the time tend to be very quiet and humble. Because if you add energy to people who are already spun up and already concerned, it tips them. It takes them over the level of good arousal into something that's not good. And I found that when I was interviewing what I was calling in extremis leaders. They were mountain climbing guides, and a woman who took HD video teams into the Indian tiger preserves to video tigers on the ground. SWAT team chiefs from the San Francisco and New York offices of the FBI. And they were all remarkably quiet, humble people. No cheerleaders. They, in no circumstances would they become angry or frustrated or fearful and let that show. Because as soon as you, as a leader, you dump your emotions on the people who are with you, you're in trouble. It's weak, and it's not something that you want to do. And the book talks a lot about how to control your emotions and how to not fall into that trap. But it's very important that leaders not pour their emotions into their people when those emotions are negative, like fear, anger, frustration.
It's such a delicate balance because emotional control is very hard. And, I'll speak from the entrepreneur perspective. As an entrepreneur, everything feels existential, like, oh God, this is either going to make me or break me, kind of thing. And so it can be very hard to keep those emotions inside, especially with the people who I might be closest with or spend the most time with. And at the same time, they're looking at me for leadership. They're not looking at me to just be this fountain of emotion and getting out of control. So they're looking for me to stay in control. And I think that's a big part of trust is the consistency that comes with my behavior because I'm able to be more in control of my emotions. But for so many people, they could just have this, like, it gets away from them.
Yeah, it does. And, the fundamental form of assistance is for people to focus outward. So when you were describing that individual just a moment ago, they were focused on themselves. What does this mean for me? What is my future? How am I going forward? And that's also highly toxic in a military context. I mean, if soldiers think their leader is doing something because of their career or their future, it would be a disaster. And so outward focus, focusing on the problems at hand, focusing on the people that you're working with, that takes away all that negative emotion because it's a different part of your brain. When you're in your prefrontal cortex, task focused on other people, you really can't feel these negative emotions that are affecting yourself. And so practice at doing that, at focusing outward. And I told all of our cadets that we worked with, and we would graduate 1,000 of them a year, all of whom were headed straight to combat for the most part. I would tell them, if you're feeling fearful or if you're feeling angry or frustrated, you're not focused. You're not focused outside yourself. So I'd never tell them, oh, you need to control your emotions. What I tell them is focus outward. You're not focused enough on the challenges that you have. And it's exactly the same in startups. As soon as a boss starts feeling wiggly because he's worried about himself, he needs to focus outward. He needs to turn towards his people, towards the challenges, study more, work more, investigate more, get more funding. And they'll wake up later and then maybe they can feel a little bit anxious about themselves. But when they're doing it, they'll be functional because they're focused outward.
You're really talking about being in support of the mission and having that be your number one driver. But what are the practices? Like, how do we actually make this work? When you say develop an outward focus and do more research and get more funding, like, what's the muscle that we need to be practicing here?
Well, most people first experience it in some form of athletics or some form of music. I mean, you can't play the piano without focus, and the same thing with tennis. You can't throw a little ball in the air and smack it over a net into a specific area without focus. So that's where we begin to learn about that. But, when you're interacting with people, you can also begin to feel that and to understand it. And the easiest practice that I'm aware of has to do with parties and other social situations. If you walk into a party as a leader or another social situation, and you find that your conversation with people is about you, stop it. Focus outward. Ask them about themselves. Ask them about their children. Ask them about their work. Ask them about their hobbies and interests. Finish that conversation with them saying, well, gee, I haven't heard anything about you. And going through that kind of outward focus in your interaction takes practice. But, after you do it for a while, it becomes who you are. And so those are two ways. And it always has to do with this ability to turn away from yourself. Don't be narcissistic. Turn away from yourself. Focus on the people you're leading, the people you're trying to influence. And it makes a huge difference. My spouse, military spouse, she was in all kinds of things. She could tell the difference between a great leader and a mediocre leader, because the great leader in conversations talked to her and asked her about her life. The weak leaders talked to me about themselves. And to her, it was just crystal clear, the difference between those kinds of individuals.
That's a very interesting anecdote about that, and where you're spending attention, and are we really externally focused? Now, I want to wind the clock back here a little bit, Tom. You're a retired brigadier general. You're in the military for a long, long time. How did you get this interest in coaching as a form of leader development? Like, I'd imagine this is not a typical career path for a lot of people from your cohort. How did this become to be your thing?
I was commanding a combat unit with 800 people in it near the demilitarized zone in the Republic of Korea. And that's when I applied for the position at West Point to be the head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, which I eventually got. And one of the things that I discovered about the way that West Point develops leaders, and they do a pretty good job of it, is that they have a group of individuals called tactical officers that are part of the structure, whose only job is to develop leadership in cadets while they're doing rifle ranges or land navigation courses or what have you. And in 2005, 5 years after I took over that job, my department connected with Columbia Teachers College. And we designed a program in conjunction with them to train these tactical officers and give them a 36 credit hour master's degree from Columbia in organizational psychology and leadership. And much of that was, we weren't calling it that, but it was teaching them how to coach. And so I was there and I watched the effectiveness of that for 12 years. And when I left West Point, I went to have a job at Yale in the business school developing a leadership program for them. And, I thought of the effectiveness of these tactical officers. And of course, there isn't anything like that in a business school. So I had to have a mechanism. I had to have a way of coaching and mentoring these MBA candidates. So I started using coaches from the International Coach Federation. And I required every MBA candidate at Yale to have a semester of coaching with a professional leadership coach.
Oh, that's cool. And I didn't get that when I got my MBA. I could tell you that for sure.
Right. So I was able to basically civilianize the West Point methodology that was so effective and pragmatic. And then when I went to Rice to build the Door Institute, it became even more important. And, when I left, and even now it's still going on, coaching was something that was offered to every undergraduate and graduate student in the university free of charge for a semester. And it wasn't like peer coaching. It was professional coaches from the Houston business community that were ICF certified. And I had a psychologist whose only job was to measure outcomes. And he basically proved how much we were impacting these students. And now 40% of that university student body is being professionally coached for at least one semester in their time at the university.
Wow, that's really tremendous. I've got a question about how we measure the effectiveness and how we know if these things are working. I've got another question I want to ask before that, which is, as entrepreneurs, we get a little bit confused sometimes about what's the difference between mentoring and coaching, because we think we have mentors, or sometimes we think we have coaches. And I want to know, from your point of view, Tom, what is the distinction between the two?
Yeah. So bottom line up front, you need both. Mentors are people who you approach and who you develop a personal and professional relationship with, so that their experiences can give you the answers you need about where you're headed. So mentors have gone our path before. Coaching is different. Coaching is a person who has developed a skill set for shaping a leader. And that comes from training, it comes from experience, but their skill set is to do that. And they're good at it. Mentors are not always great at developing leaders. They share their Rolodex with them. They work with them. They explain the things that happen to them. But in terms of how do you make a person a better leader, mentors are really not equipped for that unless they happen to be a superior leader themselves. And even then, sometimes they're not really able to develop people as leaders. So if at all possible, you really need both. And as a coach, I often discuss with my clients how they can get mentors. And many of them have a mentor when we begin working. By the time I'm done, they're going to have 5 or 7. They're going to have mentors that specialize in one area or another, one part of their life or another. But coaching, I always tell people, sometimes when I'm being hired, particularly by HR people to do coaching, they want me to have what they refer to as a chemistry session to see if there's chemistry between us. And that always frustrates me a little bit, because in coaching, it's not about chemistry. It's about the skill set. And it's like a dentist. The dentist has a skill set to fix your teeth and to do things. You don't care if you have chemistry with your dentist. And it's the same with coaches. The coaches have a professional skill set, and the chances of a coach helping a person become a better leader, if that person participates, should be 100%. There should be no question that a professional coach can move that leader forward.
Now, do you use are there certain coaching techniques that you use when you're working with leaders in high pressure environments like startup CEOs and stuff like that? Do you have a certain tool set that you're drawing on?
A little bit. So I always talk to stakeholders first. It's kind of like a 360 assessment, except I do it verbally in interview processes with stakeholders. So that happens all the time. The other thing that's different about me with startup coaches and the way that I go about it, although we do schedule sessions, I'm available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I do not require only sessions or that sort of thing. And, I have some clients in the Middle East where the middle of their day is the middle of my night. And it doesn't matter. If they walk out of a meeting confused or concerned or whatever, I want them to call me right then. I limit myself to 2 to 4 clients at a time, preferably 2, because I want to give everything I have to my clients. I want to be there for them. And if they say, gosh, we're having this crazy thing going on, I'd really like to have a face-to-face session with you. Can you fly out? I'm gone.
Yeah, the next day, say yes to that.
I'm there.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between, in my view, coaching in crisis and coaching startups, rather than coaching a more stable company where everything happens by a schedule and so on and so forth. We don't get to pick and choose when things go wrong. And I need to be available to my clients at that time.
Let's talk about results here for a second. You mentioned earlier that there had been someone you were working with who was able to study the impact. And then you also mentioned that if done right, there's 100% chance of you having an impact if they show up for the sessions and for the engagements. How do we actually measure this stuff? How do we know if it's working? Do we set very clear goals ahead of time? I mean, the reason I'm asking this question is I know a lot of people who start with a coach and maybe they just say, I want to get better at this, or I want to get better at that, but maybe they're not super definite in terms of what they're looking for. And then sometimes when they end with a coach, I say, hey, what happened? And they say, oh, I didn't get what I was looking for, or it didn't have the impact I wanted, or I didn't like him or her, or whatever it is. But how do we get a little bit more concrete here and start to really track and measure the impact?
Well, the way that we did it at Rice, and we were coaching anywhere from 200 to 400 students a semester, and that program has probably now coached 5,000 students. And we did it like this. We looked at the characteristics, the psychological characteristics of proven leaders, and we know where they, sort of where they would fall on many validated psychological instruments. We can look at those and we could say that's a leader. So we do a pre-test with the students and have them fill out some psychological instruments. And then at the end of the coaching session, we do a post-test. And what we should see is movement on those instruments towards the more, leadership focused thing. And when we do that, we know that it's coming from our coaches. And we've also done it with people who asked to be coached, but we made them wait till like the next semester.
So that's like the control group or something, or
right. We still gave them the instruments, and what we're able to do then is avoid the possibility that people who want to be coached just get better. So, we were able to test it in a very scientific way and control for other kinds of alternative explanations. And then, that gives us the benefit of knowing which of the coaches are powerful and which of the coaches are not having the kind of effect we want. Although I will tell you, a lot of it does have to do with the degree to which people want to be developed. And I mentioned that, 40% of students at Rice get professional coaching. Well, that means 60% don't. Mm-hmm. And it's their choice. And I've had a lot of people ask me, well, why don't you make it mandatory? And the reason is that doesn't work. Not in development. You could make people do it, but it's not going to be effective.
No, you got to have that intrinsic motivation. You can't just be imposing it from the outside. No, for sure. So is what you're saying that the best way for us to know? So if I'm a startup CEO and I hire a coach, the best thing to do is to kind of get a benchmark assessment of where I am today, and here's the things I'm good at, and I assume these are things like vision and communication and resilience and emotional intelligence and all this sort of stuff. So we have kind of a scorecard, and then 6 months in, 12 months in, I'm doing this again?
Yeah. So I start with two things. I start with interviews with anywhere from 8 to 20 stakeholders that know that leader. And I ask them, what's this leader's challenges? When is he at his worst? I dig in. I also give the leader an emotional intelligence instrument. And the reason I use an emotional intelligence instrument is that it's relatively easy to change a person's degree of emotional intelligence. A personality instrument is by definition enduring. It's not supposed to change. But emotional intelligence is not like that. People who have 3 of 15 subscales in the low category can move all 3 of those all the way to the top in 6 to 9 months. Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
So with that as a baseline, we go to work. And then if there's a point at which we want to assess how we're doing, I go right back to those people. And I talk to them and I ask them, can you see change, Now, I will also tell you, that if you look at the research on coaching, if a leader begins to be coached and his people know that that leader is working on their leadership, they will rank that leader higher. They will rate him or her higher, whether they've changed or not.
Right.
So as a coach, you can't like believe all the hype. You have to really dig to determine to yourself, now, is this just this halo effect, or is this person actually getting better? But if you talk to 10 people and you ask them questions about it, you will know in the end. You will know. I'm not a big fan of the 150 question 360 assessments. I mean, I've got them, but I really don't use them because they give you too much information. They're too difficult to interpret, and they're really annoying for people to fill out. I mean, they don't have 30 minutes, 50 people or whatever to do that. So I'm much better off going straight to the stakeholders and talking to them one-on-one anonymously.
Mm-hmm. And let's pull on this string around emotional intelligence a little bit here. How important is emotional intelligence in leadership, or rather, how does it manifest in a good leader?
Well, there are in the instrument I use, which is the EQI, it has 15 subscales. And some of those subscales are obvious leader qualities, assertiveness, and so forth. Some of them are a little less obvious. One of my favorites is called reality testing.
Okay.
And, that is the degree to which a person can manage their emotions and see what's happening for what it really is, and not put their emotions into it and create some alternative reality. We see that in politicians all the time, where they have this worldview that's not real. It's emotionally.
We just layer on all these stories about what happened instead of saying, here's exactly what happened. Here's what a video would have said happened.
Right. And you can imagine in dangerous places how terrible it would be to have a leader that was not in touch with reality. I mean, we're talking people get killed. I mean, quickly. And so it's the same in a startup. When you're trying to mold your company, not just in what its goals and aspirations are, but you have to put it in the context of the real world. If you don't have an accurate assessment of what's going on in the world, how can you possibly succeed? You can't.
No. Yeah, you're dead.
So things like that, leader emotions getting pushed into interpretation of reality, or the way they treat other people, or, it's really incredibly important. Much more important than personality measures, in my view, as a psychologist.
Yeah, well, no, it's great because I didn't realize what you were saying earlier, that it's much easier to change the emotional intelligence components of this stuff. The personality pieces are more fixed. What are some of the other things that a coach is going to want to work on?
When I was going through coach training, and I went through International Coach Federation training, and they will train coaches who have never done any leadership themselves, but they teach them a lot. You get taught a lot about how to ask powerful questions and how to get the client introspective enough that they come up with their own solution. And if you ask the right kind of questions, that is really very effective at getting solutions out of a client. And so, that I think is one of the really important aspects of coaching, is your ability to gain everything you can from the client's own experiences. And at the end of the day, if the client improves, that's not credited to the coach. That's credited to the client. And so, your ability to focus on making that client better themselves, teaching them to fish instead of handing them a fish. That's really very important for coaches to be able to do that. I mean, really, the International Coach Federation is built on that ability.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that. I want to ask a couple questions about your work that came up for me as I was learning more about you, and just hope that you can shed some light on some really interesting topics here. One of them is you talk about the concept of shared risk, and shared risk creating very special dynamic between a leader and his or her team. Tell us what that's all about.
Sure. Well, we discovered this in our research for that In Extremis book. And in the military, what that means is that leaders are expected to be upfront. They're expected to have the same level of risk. They don't put themselves in a position where they're protected and their soldiers are not. And that builds trust. In a civilian context, it has to do with leaders making it clear that they have skin in the game, that it's not a circumstance where if things go badly for the company, that the leader's going to be bailed out and that all the other people are going to have a disaster.
And that happens all the time, doesn't it? You see, especially in the last few years, you see all these reports of, such and such company laying off 15% of their workforce, and none of the board, CEO, VP, C-suite people, and stuff like that. And so people feel that shared risk is broken, right?
Well, it is. I mean, that's one of the reasons why more than 60% of people who are employed think their leaders aren't very good, because they're not. But in all honesty, though, if you look at that, it is a reasonable management strategy for leaders to have golden parachutes and that sort of thing. So it makes sense in terms of management. It makes no sense in terms of leadership.
Got it. Okay, thank you. The other one I was very curious about is your concepts around courage versus cowardice.
Yeah, almost no one talks about this the way that I do. It's easy to find somebody that's given a TED talk or has some kind of a workshop on courage. But in business, most of the time we don't really need courage. What we need is to not be cowardly. And cowardice, the definition of Webster definition of cowardice, includes excessive self-interest in the face of fear. And excessive self-interest is pervasive in business. Not that we want to not be self-interested, but if leaders are unable to focus outward on their people, if all they're interested in is their own gain, they will never be trusted. They'll be ineffective as leaders, and it will cost them and their organization. Leaders really do need to assess in themselves and in their people these principles of excessive self-interest. Narcissism is one of the terms that people try to use for it. Mm-hmm. But if a leader can't get off this notion that they're interested in growing and doing better and making more money, people will not trust them. They have to be able to demonstrate that while they're hoping and hope that they're going to do well economically, fiscally, and so on and so forth, that the focus is on the success of the company, which will carry the employees forward as well. And so I would much rather talk about how to manage the principles of cowardice. And that doesn't mean that people are cowards. That's an awful label. And the fact is, every single one of us are capable of demonstrating excessive self-interest, particularly in crisis. And so it's just important that we begin to understand that that's something to pay attention to. People would ask me, how do you pick, if you've got all these good officers working for you, how do you pick the ones that you promote and give commands to? And I would always say it's the ones that make all boats rise. It's not the spotlighters who are trying to show how wonderful they are, but they don't share any other ideas with good people. Those people are toxic. But when you find someone who shares all their good ideas, who helps the people on their right and on their left, they have demonstrated courage and not excessive self-interest, and they're going to be good leaders.
Another thing that I found in one of the videos on your website was this very interesting talk on leadership, in which you talk about the role of guilt, and then you talk about the concept of shame. And these are both personal and organizational. Shed some light on those, if you please.
Yeah, so I studied this pretty extensively in around 2013 or so. And one of the things I found was that guilt, interestingly enough, well, first of all, the difference between guilt and shame, guilt, you give yourself. When we feel guilty, that's us. But shame is a social phenomenon. That's when other people make you feel bad. Guilt is actually associated with better leadership, because what you have is an individual who is conscientious, who's holding themselves responsible and accountable. And that's what you want in a leader. Shame, on the other hand, is when people in the organization are making that person feel bad. And that's a toxic quality in an organization, and it's associated with much worse leadership by that individual. So, the kind of organization that leaders should build is one where if someone makes a mistake, they're hardest on themselves. And the other people in the organization are patting them on the back and saying, let's move forward. That's what you want. You don't want an organization that goes to the water cooler and talks about how bad somebody is.
Great. All right. Last one of these, because these are such interesting concepts. The last one of these, you refer to as social distance or social proximity. And let me explain how I see this happening, and then you can talk about the better way for this to happen. When something's happening and we're in crisis mode, so many times the leader will draw inward, right? And think, well, I got to go huddle, or I got to go behind closed doors, information flow stops. And a lot of this is just, it's kind of like you were saying, I'm feeding my own self-interest, or I'm turning inward instead of being outward. But my social proximity is reduced, which means I spend less time with people. I seem less available. I seem less open. And if I understand your work correctly, that's exactly when everyone needs you more rather than less. And so our instinct to isolate, or our instinct to draw back, actually defeats the purpose and is less helpful than if we were open. Did I get that right? What else do you want to add to this idea?
You got it 100% right. And often as leaders, we're helped to close off because we're talking to attorneys in our office who are saying, right, don't say anything to anyone, which is great legal advice, but it's not good leadership. So, leaders need to take on that kind of advice, whether it's coming from the attorneys or whether it's coming from HR or what have you. They need to accept that advice, but then they need to look at their organization and say, what do my people need right now? The other thing about the social connection is one of the things that helps a lot is to get money in the bank, to do it ahead of time, to connect with people in ways that make them understand you're close to them and that you would be there for them. And then if you have to close your doors, they're prepared for that. My organization at West Point had a lot of captains and majors coming in from combat tours. And when they got to working for us, one of the first things their family did was they had babies. And I would always go to the hospital I would walk into the family's room and I would ask them 3 questions. Are you getting good care here? Is somebody at home to help you with this baby when you get back there? And have you ever seen a cuter baby in your whole life? And then I would leave. I would bomb in on them, talk to them briefly, and then I'd leave. And what that caused was for people to realize that if I was there for them when they were a little anxious, they're in a hospital, they're a little anxious, but, they've got a healthy baby, so they're okay. If I was there then, they knew I would be there for them if something bad happened. And that's money in the bank. That's doing this social connectedness early so that when you can't include people on everything, they trust you anyway. It's a very bad idea to think that crisis leadership is different than the leadership that you did the week before. You have to be in the same mode all the time because otherwise it's too late. Crises come like that. And if you don't have money in the bank, if you don't have preparation for that, it's going to be very difficult for you.
Now, wrapping up here, Tom, if you were able to work with an entrepreneur, give advice to an entrepreneur who's just starting out, wanting to build a great leadership skill set for themselves, wanting to build a great company around them, what's the top 1 or 2 things they should be thinking about right now?
Well, the first thing they should be thinking about is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take 3 to 9 months, The second thing I would tell them is don't do it alone. Make sure you have mentors. Make sure you have a coach. Take that guidance and work with it, and you'll be better. I mean, if professional baseball players that are at the top of their game still need coaches, then certainly those of us who are in leadership roles can benefit from a good coach being there as well. So that's what I would tell them. I would underscore this idea of not being selfish, not focusing so much on yourself that you can't build the organization, build the team, and so forth. I would also tell them there can be some physical demands to this as well. And it's important that they kind of monitor that, that they make sure they work out at the schedule that they want to work out. Don't stop doing that just because things are changing. When things start going wrong, don't head for the liquor bottle, just
look after your whole well-being, look after all the things you need to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Well, excellent. Tom Kolditz, thank you so much for joining. And I really appreciate the perspective you're able to bring here on the coaching, on the mentoring. And it's so clear how applicable your research and work on military leadership winds up being to entrepreneurs who feel like they're, pardon the military analogy, in the trenches all the time. So thanks so much for joining. It's great to have you.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.